Welcome to Zoom In, Zoom Out, your in-depth look at how news from Taiwan is impacting the world. I'm Leslie Liao. Taiwan is often called a vibrant democracy. Freedom House calls it free, while The Economist says it's a full democracy and the strongest one in Asia. But what does that really mean in a global context? Living inside a democracy doesn't mean you can actively participate in it. And some of Taiwan's own diplomatic allies are autocracies like Eswatini, which President Tsai Ing-wen is visiting right now. To better evaluate Taiwan's democratic image, I spoke with political scientist Kharis Templeman. He's a research fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institute. We started off by discussing what it means when researchers say Taiwan is a vibrant democracy.
Well, first and foremost, that they have free, fair, and contested elections that can result in a change of ruling party. The free, fair part is hard for a lot of countries in the region, and the contested election part is hard for China and North Korea and now Russia in the region. So Taiwan is a star performer in the region, but in part because many of the other countries really fall very far short of that standard.
Now, you said Taiwan is a rising star. What pitfalls has it avoided in the region that makes it stand out in particular?
Taiwan has a strong civil society, for instance. It has a strong state capacity, pretty good transparency in its lawmaking and its voting processes. And so, a couple other countries close by, the Philippines and Korea, have had some challenges. The Philippines just has a weak state, and there's a lot of kind of low-level violence and intimidation that affects elections. And the rule of law there is quite weak. In Korea, there's kind of the opposite concern. There's I think an hyperactive prosecutoriate that goes after people for libel. And so the freedom of expression in Korea is under threat in a way that it really hasn't been in Taiwan.
And elections have their limits, right? For example, migrant workers, they're affected by Taiwan's policies, but they can't vote. Isn't there a precarious situation preventing them from engaging in civil society to the fullest extent?
Yeah, I think that's a weak spot. It's definitely a concern for international organizations that are looking at that, but it's hard to think of a country in the region that really does treat migrant workers well and provides a clear path to citizenship. And so Taiwan is not, unfortunately, an outlier in the region. You know, if you're going to be a migrant worker in Korea or Japan, I'm not convinced that's a better situation ultimately than what Taiwan has now. And Taiwan does seem to be better at Taiwan's national identity. It seems to be a bit more flexible, and so incorporating migrants from Southeast Asia into the nation of Taiwan is, I think, less of a lift than it is, say, turning Filipinos into Koreans or Japanese.
Taiwan's media environment can be said to be heavily polarized. Is that a problem when it comes to Taiwan's democracy?
Yeah, well, it's always been polarized since the early 2000s, right? There's always been green media and blue media. I think what is a little bit different today is twofold. First off, the rise of social media and alternative sources. And that has been both a good thing in terms of pluralizing the number of voices in the space, but also the kind of virality of social media means that, false reports can spread like wildfire. So that's a problem to kind of the integrity of the information space in Taiwan. And I worry, but this is not a problem that Taiwan alone faces. It's a problem that every democracy, including the United States, is facing. How do you build the kind of institutions and norms that prioritize good journalism and good, careful fact-checking of reports. The Taiwan government has adjusted a little bit. There's been quite a few new pieces of legislation and executive actions to increase transparency behind civil society organizations and media and so forth. So I think generally the trend is in the right direction, but it's still obviously a big challenge.
Young people are feeling more and more disenfranchised now. Taiwan failed to change the voting age, and housing prices are a big issue for them. How do you keep them engaged to let them feel like the country is working for them?
Yeah, so this is a case where I think an upstart third party really is valuable and can maybe make a difference in the quality of democracy. You know, the new power party got a lot of its energy from the Sunflower Movement originally and from young voters, and were able to put some items on the political agenda of the DPP that might not have been there otherwise. And so the emergence of a small party that's a threat to one of the big two forces those parties to respond to those issues in a way that they might not otherwise. But yeah, I share your concerns about the kind of the daunting economic and career challenges facing young people in Taiwan. I don't think either of the two major parties has provided a good set of solutions to those challenges, and I think partly for that reason, there's an opening for a third party like Ko Wen-je's TPP to make an appeal to those young voters, and polls are showing he's actually doing quite well among the 20 to 29 age group.
Let's zoom out and take a look at the bigger picture. Taiwan, like we said, is being described as a vibrant democracy, and it's going down this foreign policy path of working together with like-minded partners like the EU and the US. Is this democratic alliance, say, a hindrance to its foreign policy, whereas Taiwan can be working with, its closer neighbors who maybe might not have the same democratic mindset?
So Taiwan has very few formal diplomatic relations anymore, right? And the trend has been only in one direction, down. And so emphasizing shared values and institutions is an alternative way to build robust unofficial relations. And Taiwan has a lot of soft power. There's a lot of natural sympathy for Taiwan's plight today, particularly in the countries that are also democracies, that are also market economies, that are part of the U.S.-led security alliance in Asia or in Europe. And on top of that, the invasion of Ukraine has focused a lot of minds on the security challenges that Taiwan faces as well. And so there's a lot more sympathy from policymakers and ordinary people in many of these, I won't call them the West, but liberal democratic countries around the world that I think Taiwan can gain a lot by tapping into that sympathy.
The majority of Taiwan's allies are not democracies, and for a country that's very proud of its democracy and has a very successful one, how does Taiwan reconcile that?
This is the dilemma, the Maodun, shall we say, of Taiwan's foreign policy efforts. The countries that it still has, formal bilateral relations with tend to be small, in many cases not well run, in some cases autocratic, and that is in direct tension with the push to develop more robust relationships with the liberal democracies of the world. And so a good example of this is Nicaragua. The Republic of China on Taiwan had relations with Nicaragua until, I think, 2018, and they were in this just impossible dilemma where the Nicaraguan government kept asking for larger and larger grants and loans at the same time that they were suppressing free speech, jailing the opposition, effectively eliminating any alternatives in the upcoming election, and Taiwan's money was helping support that regime, right? And so the Taiwan government faced this terrible choice where they had either to stop providing loans to Nicaragua or continue to support a deepening dictatorship.
Activists have been sounding the alarm on what they call is a global backsliding of democracy. Now, is this something that is an imminent threat to Taiwan?
Not so far. I think, if anything, the trends in Taiwan have gone in the other direction, gradually, but over a 20-year period, it's quite noticeable. Taiwan is a much more robust, liberal, consolidated democracy today than it was in, say, 2003. But the threat is still there, and we can see it in democracies that emerged at about the same time as Taiwan's. The typical path to backsliding has involved an upheaval in the party system, the emergence of a kind of populist or outsider candidate who takes over and then immediately tries to erode all of the institutional checks and balances of the system, politicize the legal system, muzzle the critical media, and I think that possibility is fairly remote in Taiwan, but it's not zero. And so I think Taiwanese need to continue to be on guard against that sort of threat, because in many of these cases, like in Hungary or Poland, the countries looked pretty well consolidated in terms of democracy. And then in a matter of just a couple of years, things went very wrong very fast.
Now, what is safeguarding Taiwan from this global backsliding of democracy, especially considering that it has a huge authoritarian neighbor next to it trying to infiltrate it day after day?
Yeah, I guess I would say Taiwan's democratization and its emergence as this liberal democracy in the face of an authoritarian China that's expansionist and threatening has actually strengthened Taiwan's security position. So democracy in Taiwan is just directly and unavoidably tied to the national question about whether Taiwanese are part of China and their future should lie with mainland China, or whether their future should lie with an independent Taiwan or something in between. So the emergence of a democratic system in which that decision must be made then provides a kind of level of protection, an insulation against the China threat. They can't just buy off Chiang Kai-shek, for instance, or Jiang Jingguo. They actually have to win the assent of the Taiwanese people if they want to achieve unification under one country, two systems. And so I do think that the China threat is held at bay in part because Taiwan is such a strong democracy today.
And just a final open-ended question. With all this talk of the deterioration of democracy all over the world, what's the future of democracy on a global scale?
Yeah, so I think we're at a low point, but there are some kind of green shoots. There are some good, fairly optimistic signs in some places. I think the populist authoritarian wave that's really eroded or ended democracy in a lot of young democracies around the world has crested generally. Populists really struggled to manage COVID well, and so we've seen kind of a backlash against the backlash. Having someone who is a sober technocrat in office doesn't look so bad after you've had COVID sweep through your population, right? And so I'm an optimist. I think the medium to long-term future of democracies is still quite good, and partly because over the long run, democracies outperform autocracies in terms of economics. But at the moment, we're still at kind of a critical inflection point where, I hope we're climbing out of this hole that we've been in for the last few years.
Kharis Templeman, thank you so much for talking to us today. It's been really enlightening.
Thanks for having me on.
That was Kharis Templeman of Stanford University discussing the dilemmas of democracy in Taiwan. You've been watching Zoom In, Zoom Out. You can find more stories from TaiwanPlus on YouTube and our Facebook page. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.
I really signed up because, they asked me to, but it's still trying to, I don't really know the impressions that a target audience gets, or, the experts who are studying.
From that experience, I take the lesson that perceptions are really important because there's a strong incentive to vote never paid attention to. Had 3 candidates, and there's a similar kind of dynamic actually. You had I take the lesson that perceptions are really important because there's a strong incentive